You are enjoying your first night out with your boyfriend since you had your baby 6 months ago. You are excited to let loose and enjoy a concert with your friends. You and your boyfriend get in an argument and you break off from the group. This is the last time anyone will ever see you alive again.
Today we're going to be talking about the murder of Nikki VanderHeyden. She was born Nicole Danielle Meyer to Vicky and Steve Meyer. She was born on March 29th, 1985 in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. She also had 3 siblings, 1 sister and 2 brothers. She graduated from Denmark High School in 2003, and after that she attended the University of West Green Bay and earned her bachelor's degree, followed by a double major in science and education. To support her family, Nikki worked as a substitute teacher for the Green Bay Public School District, and she dedicated 6 years of her life to her students before she was sadly taken from them. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, and she also had a 6-month-old at the time of her murder. Her children's names were Michaela, Tyler, and Blake. After her previous relationship had ended, she actually met Douglas R. Dietrich, who went by Doug, in 2015. The two hit it off immediately. There was like an instant connection between them, and it wasn't long before they had actually moved in together and she found out that she was pregnant. After the birth of their baby boy, she had been cooped up in the house, and a bunch of her friends had actually talked her and Doug into going and seeing a band that was going to be in town all the way from California. The band's name was the Steel Panthers. She and Doug got a babysitter. The babysitter's name was Dallas, and Dallas was an acquaintance from a previous job, so she agreed to watch the baby for the night so that way she could join her friends and enjoy a night out. I mean, she had been cooped up in this house after having a newborn, so Dallas was happy to do this for her. Once the concert had ended, both Nikki and Doug had decided to move on to the next bar. However, the two did end up getting split up, and they ended up at different bars. Nikki ended up with Douglas's friends at a bar called the Sardine Can, and Doug messaged her that he would catch up with her later, that he was still at the one bar, but that he would meet up with her a little bit later on that evening. They both had quite a bit to drink, and they began to argue over text message. Their text messages to each other went as follows. Nikki, what B are you with now? F you, you abusive a-hole. You hurt me all the time. What blank are you with? Because none of your friends know. Doug, LOL, stop. Be good. I'll see you at the Sardine Can, ? So as you can see, they had already started arguing over text throughout the night. It seems to be that she was very upset with him, and from his text messages, just from the way they read, it looks like he was trying to calm her down, reassure her that he was going to meet up with her shortly. Nikki moved out to the patio of the Sardine Can after being seen on video footage dancing and enjoying her time. And you could see at this point that she had become visibly upset, and it is believed that this is the time when she was sending those text messages and receiving them from Doug. She was only out there for a few minutes before she decided to get up and leave the bar alone. And you can see that on footage that she walks out entirely alone. Nobody is with her and nobody follows her right away. The group that she was with was also outside already trying to get an Uber to go home. And when they saw her walk by them alone, they started calling towards her, asking her to come get a ride with them and to catch an Uber so that way they could get her home safe to her family. Nikki was not listening to them. She was not having it. She wanted to go and be on her own. And I understand this. At times when I'm upset, sometimes I just do need a moment to cool down. Aaron Konlinsky, I think I said that right, was Doug's friend. He was a really good guy. He actually was watching out for the girls the entire night while they were dancing. He was looking after their purses, making sure that no creeps were hanging around. But when they saw her walk by, Aaron yelled out at her and he's like, hey, like, we're getting this Uber, come on, we want to get you home safe to your kids, you've been drinking quite a bit, catch a ride with us. And she refused. There are some reports that said she actually did kind of make a scene. She started yelling at him, When he tried to reach for her, she leaned back so far that she actually fell over, and people started paying attention at this point. There are witnesses to this, and he said that at that point he just kind of backed away, put his hands up, backed away from her, and said, like, you're a babe in the woods, you shouldn't be going out there all alone. And she didn't listen. She wanted to do what she wanted to do, which is her right. So he let her go, and he got in the car with the other girls, and they caught that Uber and left. The very next day, on May 22nd, 2016, at 1 p.m., Brown County dispatchers received a call from a local farmer.
Brown County 911, what is the address of your emergency?
We just found a human body laying in the weeds.
Okay. Person beyond help, or do I need to give instructions for CPR?
No, it's beyond help. It's starting to decay.
Is it a male or a female?
It's got long hair, but I didn't go near it.
3 hours later, they received another call, but this one was from Doug, who was reporting Nikki as a missing person.
Brown County Public Safety, this is Therese.
Yes. How do I go about, the missing person?
Okay, and who's missing?
It's my girlfriend, and she does live with me, and she's never done this before.
What's her name?
Nicole VanderHeyden.
When police and detectives arrived on scene, they found a body that was unidentifiable, but what they were able to tell is that it was a female with blonde hair in her early 30s. The victim's face was covered in bruises, and she was badly beaten and had over 240 injuries to her body that had been sustained during her attack, and this is all they could tell at this point in time before doing any further investigating. The only items that were found on her body were a pair of socks and a pink wristband, similar to something that you would receive upon going to an event. So prior to this, because Doug was reporting her as a missing person, they did immediately send a police officer over to get his statement. Detective was actually concerned because it did take him so long to report her as a missing person. This is the next day, right? So they went out the evening before on the 21st, and this is the 22nd, and by now hours had passed. We're not talking a few hours, we are talking like hours, like almost 24 hours since she had been home with him at their residence. She is a mother, but she's also breastfeeding a new baby, a 6-month-old baby at home. So the detectives were concerned because there's no reason that she should not have already been checked in on or reported sooner. Like, the baby needs to eat, right? So that is why they were so concerned and immediately connected these two cases together. Now, Doug claims that when he got home, he arrived alone. It was just him and his buddy to relieve Dallas. So when the babysitter left, he then says he went and checked on his children. Once he saw that they were already in bed and that they were resting, he went to bed. Now, he claims he only got up in the middle of the night to go get a glass of water. He noticed that she still wasn't home. He assumed that she was still mad at him and was staying at a friend's house, and so he went right back to bed. After the police interviewed him, they started to view him immediately as a person of interest in her disappearance. So they actually asked him if he'd go down to the police department for further questioning. This interview lasted for 3 hours into the middle of the night, and it wasn't until 2 hours into the interview that the police even informed him that they had a female body that they had found in a farm field near their home. The detectives informed him that they couldn't let him know for sure the identity of the body because it hadn't quite been identified yet, but they did let him know that they suspected that it was her. The body did have female traits that were similar to Nikki. It was at this point that police began changing their line of questioning with him. They asked Doug who he was with, if he was angry with her, if he had taken his anger out on her after they'd been arguing that evening, and also if he had an alibi. Doug at this point states that he had absolutely nothing to do with Nikki's disappearance, and he explains to them that he loved her, and then he began crying uncontrollably.
I don't think it's been 100% identified as her, but there's a lot of similarities. What do you mean a lot of similarities? It's a physical description, height, blonde, belly button ring. Just try to relax. You're scared?
I want her back. She needs to come back. Oh, tell her.
Every last resource. I will find them, Nikki. I will find them. I love you. I love you. I love you. I really do.
The detectives at this point were trying to put together a case against Doug, and the first break in that case actually came when 2 joggers reported that they had to jump over a puddle of blood in the road that morning. This instance where the joggers had to jump over that puddle of blood was actually caught on camera by a student driver's dash cam footage. The next report they received was from their neighbor. He reported that while he was mowing the lawn that morning, that he actually ran over a charging cord with his lawnmower, and it had traces of blood on it, so he didn't quite know what to do, so he left it as it was and called police immediately so that they could get somebody out to look at it. When the police arrived, they also found more blood and actually even clumps of a blonde hair that was laying in the yard as well. So they collected everything at that time, they logged it into evidence, and immediately sent it off to the lab for testing. While they were testing all of this evidence, back at the coroner's office, the coroner was examining the body and noticed that there was a shoe print on the back of the female body. The shoe print had a herringbone pattern on it. This is how they identify what type of shoe it was, and the coroner stated that this is the type of shoe print that you would see on the bottom of a pair of Nikes. The police then interviewed family and friends, and her sister Heather stated that Doug actually was pretty abusive during the relationship. She stated that he used cocaine pretty regularly, that he would drink heavily, and often he would take his anger out on Nikki, and she confided in her sister quite a bit due to these events. Doug's ex-girlfriend Rebecca Lott was also interviewed at this time. She explained to police that he had become physically abusive, and one of their fights actually led to her breaking her ankle at one point. She stated that he wasn't a good guy. He was not your stand-up gentleman. Based off of all of the evidence that they had at the time, they were able to get a search warrant for Nikki's residence. So during the search of Doug and Nikki's house, they did find a pair of Nike Jordans, and when they were looking at this pair of Jordans, it actually had a small drop of blood on the bottom of it. So they immediately logged that for evidence. They then also found splatters of blood in the back seat of Nikki's car. The police's theory at this time was that Nikki and Doug had continued arguing from that evening, and that the argument became physical and he, in a fit of rage, killed her. And then he put her body into her car, and then he then used her car to transport her body and dump it in the field where it was found later on. Less than 72 hours after discovering the body, Brown County Sheriff's Department did decide to press charges against Doug in the murder of Nikki VanderHeyden. They began immediately putting a case together against Doug. They interviewed his friend that gave him a ride home that night and dropped him off to relieve the babysitter, Dallas. They looked into the remaining evidence that they had found in the garage. They got statements not only from Dallas, but also other witnesses from that evening. However, this investigation and their case slowly began unwinding. So they were reviewing the body cam footage from this interview of him reporting her missing. And when they were reviewing the body cam footage, they noticed that Doug had been wearing a FitBit. Now, Fitbits do track your motion throughout the night. They track your heart rate, your oxygen, and your steps. So they noticed that he had been wearing this all that evening into the concert, after he had returned home, through the whole evening of him sleeping, and then also throughout the next day. So when they pulled the data from this Fitbit, they noticed that he had only taken about 27 steps that evening. So the case had begun falling apart against him because, one, He only took those 27 steps, which lines up with his recollection of that night. 2, the blood on the shoe that they had tested had actually come back from the lab, and it turns out it was not human blood, but that of a turkey. You heard me correct. He had been turkey hunting the week before and butchered a turkey, and that's how the blood got on the bottom of his shoe. Number 3, the blood in the car was actually Nikki's daughter's. She had gotten a pretty bad bloody nose, and during this time she had taken a big deep breath out, and it splattered on the car, and they had wiped it up, but missed some of it. So that's how the blood got in her car. And the last thing, Nikki's car had actually not moved in over a week due to the GPS that was in the car. They went and tested it, and it had stayed parked in the garage the entire time. So again, he had not taken enough steps in the night to be able to commit a crime. The blood that was on the bottom of his shoe that they were wanting to tie to Nikki was actually that of a turkey's. The blood in the car belonged to her daughter, not to her, and Nikki's car hadn't moved in over a week. So due to all of this, they actually were able to drop the charges against Doug and release him from jail after he had spent 16 days in jail. He missed Nikki's funeral. He was unable to be with his son while he mourned the death of his girlfriend, the mother of his child. And this was a really hard time. And the detective does explain in an interview that he felt extremely bad because he truly thought that Doug had something to do with this. But now looking at evidence, he believed, that he had gotten the wrong guy. But this did light a fire under him, and it made him want to fight and go find who did murder Nikki. So 2 months later, they were able to catch a break in the case again. They had determined that the body did belong to Nikki because of dental records. And then they also decided to run the DNA that was found on those socks that were found on her body in the system called CODIS. So CODIS is a system that the FBI actually uses. It takes DNA from anybody that has committed a crime. They automatically get it logged into the system, and then they compare it against each other. So anytime any other future crimes are committed, they put it into the system. If CODIS puts a match on it, it's a percentage match, but they put it on it, it'll go through, analyze it, and once it analyzes it, it'll tell you if it's a confirmed match or not. So the crime lab did go ahead and run the DNA in CODIS, and they actually got a match. They got a match for a gentleman named George Stephen Birch, who had previously been arrested for murder in 2001, who was later acquitted of that crime. George Stephen Birch was 38 years old. He was 6'8" and was about 280 pounds at the time of Nikki's death. George was on probation for 5 other charges that were against him, and it did require him to stay in the state of Virginia, which obviously he did not listen to that at all. Police immediately believed that he was a transient since he was not even supposed to be in Wisconsin. So they really had no way of getting a hold of him. George had actually moved to Green Bay 3 months prior to Nikki's murder. He lived with his friend Edward Jackson and his wife Linda at the time. He stated that he was just looking for a fresh start, and so he asked him if he could stay with them for a little while until he could get on his feet. George had been borrowing Ed's car at the time. It was a red Chevy Trailblazer, and it was actually involved in a hit and run the night of the murder. When the vehicle was located, they found the front seat had actually been set on fire. Totally sketch, but that's what happened. During the report of the car accident, he actually handed over his phone and gave him the address to where he was staying. Because he willingly gave his phone up to the police, Brown County Sheriff's Department immediately put in for that to be transferred to their facility so that way it could be used in Nikki's investigation. When they reviewed the data from George's cell phone, they were actually able to track his movement the entire night. He spent most of the night at a bar that he frequented called Richard Cranium's, and they believe that this is actually where he met Nikki for the first time. The police had their own theory about how this evening played out. They believe that Nikki ran into George at the bar, that they chatted for a little bit and he offered her a ride home. They then believe that once they arrived to the destination that she had provided him, that he made some sexual advances towards her and she immediately rejected him. This caused him to get angry and then he sexually assaulted her. Nikki managed to get out of the car, stumbling out, falling into the curb, where he then begins to curb stomp her. This would cause the footprint on her back and would also explain the pool of blood that was located outside of her residence. Now again, his phone did track his movement, so because it tracked him the entire night, it went from the bar to her residence and back to where Nikki's body was finally found. Originally, police had no way to be able to locate George, but because he did give his address during the police report of the missing car, the police were able to immediately go to his residence and arrest him. Of course, George lawyered up immediately and refused to talk to the police, and he never actually opened up about the murder until he went to trial. His trial began on February 19th, 2018, nearly 2 years after Nikki was murdered. Once he got to trial, he actually pointed the finger at the detective's first suspect, and that was Doug Dietrich. During the trial, George was called to the stand, and this is when he laid out his chain of events for the evening. He claims that the sex was consensual, that he was going to take her back to his place, but because his roommate's dad was awake and walking around, that they ended up leaving and he took her back to her place. Now he states that while they were back at her place, that one thing led to another and they began having sex in the back of the Trailblazer. He says that he didn't murder her, but that in fact Doug did it in a fit of anger after catching them having sex in the back of that Trailblazer. He then proceeds to testify that he was forced by Doug at gunpoint to move Nikki's body and go dump it somewhere far away from the house.
The next thing I remember was the person behind me had been saying, the first thing I was coherent to me that I could hear them say was, "Look what the you made me do."
Did you know if she was alive or dead at that point?
I didn't know if she was alive. There was a lot of blood on her face, come out of her mouth, on her back.
What was Dietrich doing at this point?
He was standing behind me with he still had the firearm in his hands, pretty much directing me what to do.
When the prosecution is able to cross-examine him, they are actually able to break down his story with one photo. Now this was a photo that was taken of him fishing the day after he witnessed her brutal murder. The same day Nikki's body was found, he actually had gone on a fishing trip with his roommate, and there were a lot of photos taken of that fishing trip to basically show off their catches for the day. In this photo, you can clearly see that his right hand had bruises and scratches on it, consistent with being into some altercation of some sort. But he claims that he didn't fight Doug that night. In his statement, he said that Doug hit him in the back of the head while they were in the middle of intercourse. This knocked him out, and when he woke up, he at that time found her body beaten to death. Therefore, where did these cuts and bruises come from? Now, both sides did their best to plead their cases, but ultimately, this rested in the hands of the jury.
This is clearly a whodunit case. Their explanation is ridiculous and it's insulting to your intelligence. It tries to make you believe this encounter was consensual as far as sexual activity. Killing her is not enough. He seeks to defame her. Nikki did not go gently into the night. We ask you to return a verdict of guilty for first-degree intentional homicide. Thank you.
Justice for Nicole is not going to be delivered by a wrongful conviction of George Birch. Just because a story sounds ridiculous or sounds unbelievable doesn't mean it is. And there's a full-scale investigation into Doug Dietrich. We've seen the evidence. We've seen him testify. He had the motive, the opportunity, and the connection to this crime. He didn't call the police until after Nikki's body was found. He knew why. He didn't want the police to come. He was trying to cover up what he did. As we sit here right now, you are literally surrounded by doubt. You are surrounded by reasonable doubt. That's why you must return a verdict of not guilty.
The closing arguments were wild on both sides and honestly very convincing. I do not envy the jury's responsibility in this case at all. It was expected that the jury would need days, if not weeks, to deliberate. They did not. It took the jury only 3 hours to come back with a verdict. When the verdict was read, George hung his head but was entirely emotionless.
State of Wisconsin versus George Stephen Birch, Brown County Case 16 CF 1309. The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Stephen Birch, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, is charged in the information. It is signed by our foreperson and dated this first day of March 2018. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this your verdict? They are saying yes and shaking their heads.
The jurors explained that it really only came down to one piece of evidence. One piece. And that was the charging cord that the detectives had logged into evidence early on in the investigation. This charging cord did not have Doug's DNA on it. It only had George's DNA and Nikki's DNA on it. And this charging cord was believed to be the murder weapon, which is insane to me. Like, the charging cord in itself is just wild because the neighbor ran this charging cord over with his lawnmower. Like, this is what prompted him to call 911 because he ran over the cord, saw that there was a little bit of blood on it, and so he called 911. And that is the only way that they have any evidence in this case. That's where they found the pool of blood, the hair, all of it. Like, that is so crazy. Kudos to that guy for calling 911 because I cannot say that given the same circumstances that I would have done that. Like, I would have probably thrown it away, and that breaks my heart. So that just makes me want to be so much more aware of my surroundings going forward. During sentencing, the judge laid into George. And on May 4th, 2018, he sentenced George Stephen Birch to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The maximum sentence in the state of Wisconsin.
The punishment must fit the crime. Feelings about the death penalty aside, what if this was such a jurisdiction? Would this kind of crime, would this case, with these facts and this impact, justify a death penalty? The answer is yes, Mr. Birch. This is a crime that would, I believe, merit the death penalty, and for that you have to die in prison. So, you have to die in prison, Mr. Birch, and I could say 100 years or 200 years, or I could do what the family says and just order life without parole. They've suffered enough. I think that's commensurate with what this crime is all about. That will be the vehicle that the court will use to ensure that you spend the rest of your life in prison.
After the trial, Doug had to adjust to life without Nikki as a single dad to a now toddler. So Nikki's sister Heather actually did end up moving in with Doug to be able to help him out and help him be able to get on his feet. However, it wasn't long before cops were dispatched to the residence for domestic violence. You heard me correct? Nikki's sister and Doug had actually gone out to a birthday party at a tavern. And when they were leaving in the car, Doug had actually made some sexual advances towards her and began touching her leg. And she immediately told him to stop and said, "Please don't." And it was at this time that Doug became very angry with her. He began driving at high speeds and refused her pleas to stop the car and let her out. And at one point he had actually ran a stop sign and he was not going to let her out. And the only reason he actually did stop to let her out of the car was because she began kicking at the windshield. and he pulled over and threw her out of the car. Now, charges were brought against Doug for this, but he pleaded no contest to both charges. So because he had actually pleaded no contest to the charges, that's where you admit guilt without actually saying you're guilty. He got away with only paying a $1,000 fine and spending a few nights in jail, which is so crazy to me because that poor girl, like, she knows that he was domestically violent towards her sister, and then to have to endure this is just awful. I feel so bad for her. But that's everything for this case today, you guys. Please comment below and let me know what you think. I really want to hear what you have to say about this. Do you think that the jury got it correct and George is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Or do you think that Doug got away with murder? Either way, honestly, this has been a wild one, so I really want to see what you guys have to say about it. Until next time, bye guys.